Okay, so today we're going to have a look at the fifth Mishnah of the third chapter of Pirkei Avos. And in doing so, we're going to meet a new rabbi, someone we haven't yet encountered in our studies, in our journey through the Pirkei Avos. So who we're going to meet today? We're going to meet somebody called Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, just to give you a little bit of context, he was a contemporary of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So that means that he lived just before the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Very tricky and trying time for the Jewish community generally. There was Roman persecution. There was already an issue with trying to learn Torah at that time. It wasn't an easy time when Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana lived. Now, what's interesting about it, there's a few things that are quite interesting about Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Perhaps once you start to hear these things, you realize this is somebody we should really know a lot more about. How come we don't know more about him? How does he get so overlooked? So just to give you a little bit of perspective. Number one, he was one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva's colleague, Rabbi Yishmael. So if you think about that and the incredible influence that he must have had being such a teacher, so that already tells you, like, how come we don't know more about this man? Also, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana was a person who composed certain beautiful prayers, that some of which are part and some of which are not necessarily part of our liturgy today. So that in itself is interesting. And then Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana was the author of what's arguably one of the earliest books of Kabbalah that exists. It's called the Sefer HaBahir. Bahir means clear. So it's almost like the Sefer, the book of clarity, almost in a sense. Sefer HaBahir. So that already tells you this is a very colorful personality. This is somebody who has impact on so many areas of Judaism. What is also interesting about Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana is that he lived a very long life. He's buried in Sfat. And his students asked him, you'll see this a few times in the Gemara, that there were rabbis who lived a particularly long time, and their students asked them, what did you do? What did you do right that earned you the opportunity to live so long? So Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana says that what he did is that he was always careful not to be what we call miskabed bikloin chavero, which means that he was always absolutely careful never to have any personal benefit from somebody else's shame. You know, sometimes that's what happens. A person is humiliated, a person is exposed, and somebody else rides the wave. You know, somebody else has the opportunity to become a big deal because somebody else went down. And Rabbi Nechunya was absolutely clear that he was never going to do something like that, and that's what he attributed his long life to. So, because we have this context, remember that this is the chapter so far. The thrust of this chapter has been all about the importance of learning Torah. And the idea that, even when you're in the middle of eating, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai told us you've got to learn Torah as well. And then last week we learned that even when you're walking on the road and you have to pay attention to where you're going, even then you're supposed to learn Torah. So that was Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinoi. And now today we're going to learn something else about Torah. But as soon as we start this Mishnah, I'm pretty sure that you'll immediately detect that there's language we haven't yet come across. A particular kind of phrase that we're going to use over here that we haven't yet explored in any of the things that we have learned about learning Torah. So what's the thrust of this Mishnah? Exactly along the theme of the chapter, how incredibly important it is to learn Torah. And not just that it's incredibly important to learn Torah, but as we're about to discover, sometimes it's not so easy to learn Torah. Again, bear in mind, when did Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana live? At a time when it was difficult to learn Torah. There was this very heavy expression of authority, the Roman Empire, hanging over people's heads. And because of that, they had many responsibilities. They were a bit afraid to learn Torah. So this is a perfect scenario where you would expect that people did not necessarily feel that they could learn Torah in the normal way. And that's exactly what Rabbi Nechunya wants to address. He wants to say, just because you believe that your circumstances are such that you should not be learning Torah or that you are excused from learning Torah, the opposite is true. Dafka, when you're going through difficult times, dafka when there's so much weighing down on your mind, that's dafka when you have to learn Torah. So as I say, he's going to introduce a phrase that we haven't yet seen, and we're going to have to understand what that phrase means. Let's have a look at the Mishnah. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana Oimer, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana taught, Kol ha-mekabel alav oil Torah, any person who accepts on themselves the yoke of Torah, ma'avir mimenu oil malchus ve'oil derech eretz. then what happens is that they, it doesn't tell us who they is, but it's obviously referring to Hashem or to the so-called heavenly court, removes from that person the yoke of government and the yoke of Derech Eretz. Now, most of us understand Derech Eretz in the wrong way, unfortunately. Not because it's been poorly translated, but because we just think there's only one interpretation of Derech Eretz. So most people tell you Derech Eretz is about being well-mannered and being respectful, and that's why we always tell people that it's so important to have Derech Eretz, and Derech Eretz Kadma la Torah, that Derech Eretz precedes or takes precedence over the Torah. It's not exactly true. The real meaning of the word Derech Eretz, as it is used in Mishnah language, in Talmudic language, what's Derech Eretz? The way of the world. And a big part of the way of the world, and especially what Rabbi Nechunya is going to focus on over here, is what you have to do in order to earn a living. So what does he say? Any person who accepts on himself the yoke of Torah will have removed from him the yoke of government and the yoke of trying to earn a living. And then he tells us the corollary. And any person who rejects the yoke of Torah, then they place on that person the yoke of government and the yoke of Derech Eretz, of earning a living. So, the first thing we have to understand over here is this language, oil, a yoke. Maybe it's a little bit far-fetched for us because we don't live in an agricultural society, so we're not really familiar with the idea of a yoke. Back in the day, before there was the mechanized reality that we live in, before the Industrial Revolution, the ox played a very important role in the agricultural system because the ox used to pull the plow. So you'd put the yoke onto the ox, and then you could attach that machinery. You could attach the plow, or you could attach your wagon, and the ox could pull the wagon. So for us, it's a little bit, it's a little bit outside of our frame of reference, this idea of a yoke. What exactly is a yoke? What does it mean? So conceptually, having a yoke on your shoulders means that there's somebody else that you are responsible towards, somebody else who is in control. So the moment we say that you accept the oil, Kabbalah's oil, it's an expression that is used quite broadly in Judaism. Kabbalah's oil means that you accept the yoke of authority. Usually we use the expression Kabbalah's oil Malchus Shamayim, to accept the yoke of Hashem's sovereignty. In other words, to say, I'm going to do what Hashem says. Whatever Hashem expects of me, I'm committed, I'm dedicated, I accept the yoke. I take that responsibility on myself. There's another expression that we use, which is Kabbalah's oil mitzvahs, to accept the yoke of mitzvahs. So for example, when you look at the Shema, the first paragraph of the Shema we're told is Kabbalah's oil malchus shamayim. The intention that you're supposed to have when you say the first paragraph of Shema is, I accept Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem is one, Hashem is our God, Hashem is real, that's what counts, that's the only thing, and therefore I accept Hashem's authority. Then you get to the next part, especially the second paragraph of the Shema, the third paragraph of the Shema, that get into more specifics, and the mitzvah of tzitzis, and remembering Egypt, and not veering after your eyes and heart. That's called Kabbalah's oil mitzvahs. After you accept Hashem's overarching authority, then you accept that you're going to do the specifics, you're going to do the mitzvahs. In this Mishnah, we're talking about something slightly different, Kabbalah's oil ha-Torah, to accept the yoke of Torah. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the yoke of Torah? I get it. I can understand what it means if a person says that you accept the yoke of heaven. In other words, you accept Hashem's authority. That makes absolute sense. You can even understand when a person says that you accept the yoke of mitzvahs, because the implication is, maybe I don't necessarily understand why I should do these mitzvahs, right? That happens to us sometimes, right? Sometimes we have mitzvahs and we think, my goodness, why am I doing this? What does it actually mean? What's so relevant or important about this? So sometimes we have a mitzvah and we don't necessarily feel that it's easy to do. So we have to have Kabbalah soul. You accept the authority. Hashem says this is how I have to behave. Maybe I don't find it easy, but I'm committed, I'm in. But why do you say oil? How do you use the expression of yoke when you're speaking about Torah learning? Because if you think about it, Torah learning is not something that you do because you just got to toe the line. You learn Torah because it's stimulating, it's challenging. Why are we having this shiur right now? Why do people love Pirkei Avos so much? Because it's stimulating, because it's exciting, because it's relevant, because it's personal, because it's going to make you a better person. So why on earth do we say over here, Kabbalah's oil, that you're going to accept the yoke, which almost sounds as if it's something which you have to just accept blindly when you're talking about Torah? And a little bit more specifically, when it comes to Torah, we're told not only do we have the responsibility, not only do we have the requirement to learn Torah, but we're told you're supposed to learn Torah with a sense of joy, with a sense of optimism, with an excitement. Wow, look at the Sos anoichi alim rasecho kamoitze shalom rav. That's how King David describes it. I rejoice over your Torah like a person would rejoice if they found a huge treasure. That's how you're supposed to learn Torah. So why we're suddenly using this expression of oil, like it's a yoke? I don't know about you, but to me, the minute I hear the word yoke, it sounds like it's heavy, it's a burden, it's something that you just have to accept, you have to shoulder. How on earth does that fit with Torah? So various commentaries try to give us various perspectives on why that is, and some of them are incredibly beautiful, and some of them are very personally challenging. So the first insight that we're going to have a look at from the Medrash Shmuel, he says that the idea of this yoke of Torah, the implication of the yoke of Torah is sometimes when a person's learning Torah, and I'm sure we're familiar with this because it's probably happened to all of us, that you get to a part of Torah and you say, it's not going in. I just don't get it. I don't get it. I don't understand this part of Torah. Ever happened to you? Probably not. Okay, it happens sometimes to some people, hypothetically. You're learning a piece of Torah, you think, I just don't understand it. So it's very tempting for a person to say, you know what? I read it. I kind of covered that chapter. Now I'm going to move on, and hopefully the next piece that I read or the next subject that I learn, okay, I was a little bit stuck in this piece of Gemara, and I'm going to learn something about the parasha because that's a little bit more relatable. So very often a person says, you know what, I'm not going to keep pushing and banging my head against the wall on an issue that I don't seem to understand. Let me rather focus on another area of Torah, which I do understand, and therefore I can enjoy it and I can experience, I can have all those wonderful things. I can rejoice over the learning of Torah. So comes along Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana and he says, oil. You've got to shoulder the weight. You've got to put on that yoke, meaning to say, yes, it makes sense that sometimes when you're learning something, it does not feel like you're ever going to break it through. And you just feel, I've got to move somewhere else. Says Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, don't take that attitude. Keep trying. Keep trying and trying, because eventually if you carry that yoke, in other words, you show that you're so dedicated to learn in the way that Hashem would want you to learn, then Hashem will help you to understand it. And you'll eventually reach a point where even what you thought you could never understand, guess what? You actually end up understanding it. By the way, if this sounds too far-fetched or too theoretical, try it sometime. You'll be amazed at the results. It's actually fascinating how when a person revisits and reviews and tries to understand something, even if it's over the course of many years, like a colleague of mine was saying today, he said he's suddenly come to realize how he studies a little bit of the book of Tanya every single day, and he's suddenly come to realize that he's never understood any of it. Okay, that's considered progress. When you get to the point that you understand that you haven't ever understood, that's actually when your eyes start to open. There are many stories in our history of individuals who were not necessarily the smartest. Look at Rabbi Akiva. Famous story. I'm not saying Rabbi Akiva wasn't smart, but the famous story of Rabbi Akiva when he started at the age of 40 in a classroom together with children who were just starting grade 1. I mean, can you imagine that? And the famous metaphor that he experienced firsthand with the water dripping onto the stone. That's what Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana is telling us, and that's possibly one of the first things Rabbi Akiva may have learned as he started to study. Keep persevering. Like the ox that has the yoke on its shoulders, it keeps going and it does what it has to do, and eventually that soil breaks open, and eventually you plow that field, and eventually things begin to grow. That's one explanation. Another very beautiful explanation is that the nature of an ox is that, this is the Chofetz Chaim says, that when the ox has the yoke on its neck, it cannot remove the yoke. Doesn't matter how brilliant your ox is, how beautiful you think. At the end of the day, the ox cannot remove the yoke from its own neck. And that's exactly how it is with us in Torah. Not in a negative way, not to say that we're overwhelmed by the Torah and we're stuck. No way out. Sorry for you. It's just a function of being Jewish. You're stuck with the Torah, whether you like it or not. It's something far deeper than that. It's telling us that the Torah is actually part of us. It's intrinsic to who we are. We don't just learn Torah. The expression goes that Oraisa Yisrael Oraisa v'Kudsha Brichu Kulo Chad, that the Jewish people and Hashem and the Torah are one entity. Torah is not foreign information. It's not like you're doing a course. You want to study to become an actuary, or you want to become an engineer. So the information is information, and you are who you are. And then you have to make a marriage between the two. You've got to somehow get the information into your system. Just like that ox cannot escape its yoke, we cannot escape the Torah. It is part and parcel of who we are. So that's why even if a person feels that maybe it's not so exciting, and maybe I'm not so motivated, and maybe I'm not as good as I should be with my learning, it's actually irrelevant, because the Torah is me. It's part and parcel of who I am. So as I start to push myself through the process, so I will discover that the Torah actually seeps in and becomes part of who I am. There's another angle, another perspective that we've got to consider, and that is that some of the commentaries say, look, unfortunately, there are some people out there who just don't get it. They try and try and try as they might, and the Torah just doesn't go in. Some people are just not intellectual. That's the reality. So if that's the case, if a person is in a position that they cannot learn Torah because of their own intellectual limitations, then they have to carry the yoke of Torah. That means to say they have to support other people who learn Torah, because by supporting other people who learn Torah, you get to share in the merit of them having learned Torah. However, there is another concept that we have to consider over here as well. So we've spoken about the idea of like you're battling and battling and battling, and you can't get the idea into your head. Keep pushing like you've got that yoke on your shoulders, and eventually the Torah will seep in. But there's another perspective here too. And this is going to become the main theme that we're going to look at through the course of this Mishnah. And that is, sometimes a person reaches a point where they say, this area of Torah doesn't talk to me. And I know that you're supposed to learn Torah, as the expression goes in the Gemara, La'olam yilmed adam b'makom sheli bo chafetz, that a person should always learn Torah in a place where that person has a desire. Now, many people understand that very simply as being a geographical place. Where should you learn Torah? In a place where you're happy. And it's simple psychology 101, right? If you're happy in your environment, you will perform better. And that means that you'll learn better. So we get it. But there's a deeper meaning. It means everybody has different areas of Torah that they love and enjoy more than other areas of Torah. It's just because of how we're wired. Some people love Gemara. Some people love mysticism. Some people love history. Some people love philosophy. Some people like cut and dry halacha. So everybody has the place of Torah where they resonate. It's part of the Torah that just really talks to them. Other parts of Torah, less so. So you may believe that because Torah is supposed to be an enriching experience, and it's supposed to be a personal experience, and it's supposed to be with joy, so you might think that I should avoid those areas of Torah that I don't connect with, and only focus on the areas which I resonate with. Therefore comes Rabbi Nechunya ben Akon, and he says, no, you've got to carry the yoke of Torah. The yoke means that you have to be willing to push yourself, even to learn the parts of Torah that you don't necessarily resonate with. Now, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akona, as an individual, he lived through this, because he lived at a time of Roman oppression, which meant that many people didn't resonate with learning Torah because it was scary for them. They just literally believed that if they would learn Torah, they could imperil their own lives. So therefore, he's the one who says, no, Kabbalah Sol, you've got to accept the yoke. You've got to carry the Torah as your yoke, even if it's not comfortable, even if it's inconvenient, even if you have other things on your agenda. And with that, actually, if you think about it, there he was talking about the Romans. He could have just as well been speaking to us today. Why? Because one of the biggest issues that we have today, it's so ironic, but one of the biggest issues that we have today is we feel we don't have enough time. Here we are, we've dedicated some time on a Monday morning to learn Pirkei Avos. For some of us, it is one of many shiurim that we attend or participate in. And for other people, it's, this is my time. This is my donation to God. Hashem, you should really appreciate it. I found 45 minutes on a Monday morning, and I'm giving it to you. So please, you should give me something nice in return. Because one of the biggest issues that we have in the modern world, and it's highly ironic, is we claim a lack of time. There was an article, I don't remember in what publication, in the 1930s. And the article said that by the time we would reach where we are now, the 21st century, we would have, I think it said something like 40% more free time because of automation than they had then. Can you only imagine? It was unthinkable. Just imagine if you still had to go down to the river to draw water, and if you still had to light a fire every single night in order to produce a meal, and if you still had to kasher your own chickens and treva your own meat, and if you still had to plant your own vegetables or walk to the market, you imagined in your mind that if there would be a society where water would run into your home automatically and you could buy ready-made, ready-packaged food, you would imagine, obviously, you'd have a lot more time. How ironic that we probably feel that we have less time today than we ever had before. Why? Because of Ol Malchus and Ol Derech Eretz. The more things change, the more they remain the same. We have exactly the same problems. Ol Malchus and Ol Derech Eretz. We have pressure on us because of the governments under whom we live. So, for example, there are taxes that we have to pay. You've got to go once in a while to renew your driver's license. And everybody knows what it's like to be in a bureaucratic setting. You know, you've got to go there and you've got to sit in line and nobody knows what they're doing. And it doesn't matter which country in the world you are. Everybody complains about bureaucracy. So there's the Ol Malchus. There's all the things that the governmental regulate. You know, once upon a time you lived in a simple society, a subsistence society. Nobody was on your head with all of these mishugasim. And then Ol Derech Eretz, the way of the world, you understand what we have to do. You got to earn a living, and you have to go to gym, and you have to do so many lifts every day, and you have to go browse all the malls. You know, it's really important. What happens if the new season comes out and you don't get to see the line of products? There's some very heavy things in our lives. So believe it or not, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, living almost 2,000 years ago, addressed exactly this issue in exactly the language that speaks to us. And he says you have a choice in life. You have a choice. You have a choice. This is the key to Jewish time management. The choice is, are you going to live a life shackled to the realities of Ol Malchus and Ol Derech Eretz? Or are you going to choose to live a life connected to the reality of Ol Torah? That is the choice that every single one of us has as a Jewish person. And so effectively you could say that there are three realities in which a person could live. The one reality is that their entire life is dictated by their personal circumstances. That's how some people are. Their entire life is dictated by their personal circumstances. So that means how I'm feeling today. It means how much money I have in the bank. It means how much sleep I had last night. All that kind of thing. Some people, that is where life begins and ends, just in their personal realities and their personal circumstances. And that's what he calls Ol Derech Eretz. If a person believes that their entire reality is determined just by their personal circumstances, that's what we call the Yoke of Derek Eretz. Other people live their life affected by societal influences. That means to say, it's not just that I had enough sleep last night, so that's why I'm lucid today and I'm in a good mood. It's more than that. It's, did you hear? We live in the did you hear world, right? Did you hear the devastating fires in Cape Town? Did you hear about the price of petrol? Did you hear about rising anti-Semitism in whichever country, France? You know, the absolute miscarriage of justice in this Sarah Halimi case. You know, so all these things bear down on me. I'm not saying that these things are not real, but a person who lives, that these things weigh on me. I feel that I am heavier, I'm depressed. It's difficult to live in the world because of what is going on around me. That's called Ol Malchus. That's the person who's living, carrying the weight of the yoke of the Malchus, of the kingdom, of the broader society. So there are two possibilities. Either what makes me heavy, what's my oil, what gives me stress in my life is my personal stuff, or the oil, the yoke that I carry is broader stuff, global stuff, communal stuff. That's what weighs me down. So those are the two realities that a person typically would live with. Comes along Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana and he says, if you're Jewish, you have an escape clause. You have the possibility of living with a completely different reality that is called Ol Torah, the weight of Torah. And I'll tell you a fascinating thing about this, which we just, not so long ago was Pesach. So we just had this on our agenda. When you read the story of the Jewish people in Egypt, it says that the Egyptians made them slaves, and they made them work harsh labor. They made them work with chomer, which is mortar, and levanim, which are bricks, and all kinds of work in the field. Now we know, as we say in the Haggadah, we say, that in every generation we have to view ourselves as if we have the opportunity to escape Mitzrayim. So obviously that implies that in every generation we have to view ourselves that we live in Mitzrayim. Right? If you can escape Mitzrayim, that implies that you're living in Mitzrayim. So what does it mean to live in Egypt, to live in Mitzrayim? So the implication of living in Mitzrayim is that all of those things that the Egyptians imposed on the Jews back then, those are things that apply in our world as well. Which means that there are things that bear down on us, that make us feel that we're overwhelmed, that we're stressed, that we have so much to do, etc., etc. So there's a beautiful insight, a mystical insight that says there's a way that we could, so to speak, magically mitigate all of these things. How so? So it says in the Zohar, chomer, the mortar that is referred to in that pasuk, da kalva chomer. That means the mental gymnastics of trying to work out the process called kalva chomer. Kalva chomer is when you work through a concept and you say, if this is how things are in this particular scenario, how much more so would it apply? In other words, it's the logical extrapolation of a concept. So chomer da kalva chomer, that refers to a kalva chomer. Levanim, bricks, da libun hilchasa. That is the process of trying to clarify libun from the word white. So you're trying to get the clear, pure view of an halachic issue. So you've got to work hard. It's a lot of mental strain in order to decode what the Torah has to say in a particular environment, in a particular scenario, so that you'll know how to apply it in halacha in practical legal terms. So, what's it basically telling us? We have an opportunity to choose. We could either be bound by the pressures of the world as we know it, derech eretz, the pressures of what's going on in my own life, or malchus, the pressures of what is going on broadly in the entire world. Or alternatively, we have the opportunity to do what? To take on the load of Torah. But it has to then be a load. It's not just that, okay, I'm going to learn Torah, it's a little bit of, like a nice little vort. I heard a concept over here. It's like a nice idea. It's got to be oil. It's got to be something which it's what we call sweat equity. It takes a lot of effort. That's what Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana wants us to know. Any person who accepts oil Torah, that they're going to learn Torah as if that is my stress, that is what weighs on me, I'm most concerned about whether or not I came to understand the principle in Torah properly, then ma'avir mimenu oil derech eretz, oil malchus v'ol derech eretz. Then, from such a person, they remove oil malchus and oil derech eretz, the worries of this world. As the Rambam says, what does it mean to accept old Torah? To learn Torah with absolute consistency. That's old Torah. When you're not like wishy-washy, sometimes I'm learning, sometimes I'm not learning. It's with absolute consistency. Then if a person does that, they excuse themselves, they immunize themselves against the extraneous stresses that usually invade our lives. And that's how you get to succeed with so-called time management. What does it mean that you succeed with time management? So one of the explanations of ma'avirin mimenu, that they remove all of these pressures, is that the things that used to take longer take less time. Because now you've invited Hashem into your world with this oil Torah, with this total dedication to Torah. So you've invited Hashem into your world. Once you invite Hashem into your world, everything that you touch turns to gold. Everything that you touch is more successful. There's an expression, very interesting expression, where it says, it's not exactly on the theme, but just to illustrate the point. So it says that if a person engages in Torah learning in such a way that you actually help other people to learn, because some people become a little bit self-absorbed in their learning. I have to learn, so therefore I need time. So therefore I don't want to be distracted by other people and the things that they may or may not want to talk about or to learn about. But there's an interesting expression that it says, when a person learns Torah with somebody else with a view to dafka teach and illuminate somebody else, Then it says, Nasin moicha v'libai zachin elef pe'omim kocha. Then the person's own mind becomes 1,000 times clearer, which means quite literally that what would have taken a certain period of time to learn, you can now do in 1,000th of the time. It's a similar kind of process, or a similar kind of concept that we're speaking about over here, where we say that if a person dedicates themselves to learning Torah, then Hashem blesses the person that the rest of the time that they are engaged with whatever it is that they have to do, either for their own livelihood or for their responsibilities to the government, those will be taken care of. Now, what's interesting about this is we have historical precedent. So if you think that what Rabbi Yehuda ben Akon is talking about over here is pie in the sky, here's where it actually happened once before in history, right at the beginning of Jewish history. We know that the Jews went to Egypt because Yosef at the time was the leader, the viceroy of Egypt, but essentially you could call him the minister of finance. And therefore he had this incredibly important role in this incredibly important position. It was a difficult time, it was a famine, and so he invited his whole family to come down to Egypt. So they came down to Egypt under very positive circumstances. The sad part of the story, as we well know, is that after Yosef and his brothers passed away, then Pharaoh pretended as if there had never been a Yosef and there had never been this miraculous salvation of the Egyptian economy. And he very quickly turned things around and he turned the Jews into slaves. And that persisted for over 200 years, that the Jews were slaves. Now here's something really interesting. For the 210 years that the Jews were slaves, in the worst times, including when babies were being thrown into the Nile, and when they were being cemented into the walls of the buildings that the Jews were building, in the midst of all of that, the entire tribe of Levi never became slaves. It's fascinating that such a thing could ever have occurred. It makes no logical sense whatsoever. We know that later on when Moshe came to confront Paroi to let the Jewish people go, we know that that Pharaoh said to Moshe and Aaron, he said, Moshe v'Aaron l'chulu sivloseichem, go to your nice, calm, quiet life that you live as a member of the tribe of Levi, because basically he acknowledged that they and their kind were not slaves. Isn't that fascinating? The tribe of Levi in the worst time of the Egyptian exile were untouched by the exile. Why? Because the tribe of Levi were the people who were dedicated to study Torah. Even though the Torah wasn't given, so whatever Torah they studied is obviously minuscule compared to what we have in Torah today, but it doesn't change the fact they studied Torah in that environment at that time. What happened? They did not have Ol Malchus. They did not have the pressure of not just any government, but this terribly autocratic, overwhelming Egyptian government had no impact on their lives. Why? Because they accepted Oil Torah, the Yoke of Derek. After that, when the Jewish people left Egypt and they went to Mount Sinai, and collectively, now not just as a single tribe, but the entire Jewish people all accepted Naseh v'Nishma, completely the Oil Malchus Shamayim, what happened to them? They started to eat manna, food that fell from heaven, even though, of course, that food started to come before the giving of the Torah. But we know that the reason they left Egypt, as Hashem had told Moshe at the burning bush, was only in order to get them to Torah. So once they were committed to Torah, they didn't have to worry about a livelihood. They didn't have to worry about food. Food was delivered to them. So Hashem does this to set the precedent for us that if you makabel ol Torah, if you accept the yoke of Torah, ma'avir mimenu ol malchus v'ol derech eretz, then you can see very clearly that a person will be exempt from the other responsibilities in life. Now, if you read a little bit between the lines over here, you can actually see that there are three categories that Rabbi Yehuda ben Akon talks about. Two of them he speaks about overtly, and one of them he just alludes to. So he starts off by saying, Kol ha-mekabel ol Torah, any person who accepts on themselves the yoke of Torah, and then he compares that to ha-poirek mimenu, anybody who rejects the yoke of Torah, which, by the way, the Rambam had different opinions what it means to reject, but the Rambam is of the view that to reject the yoke of Torah would mean that a person claims that the Torah is not divine. So, in other words, rejecting the yoke of Torah doesn't necessarily mean that a person doesn't learn. A person may actually enjoy the academics of Torah, but forget that there's a God linked to the Torah, and that Torah is nothing more than Hashem's wisdom. That in itself is a rejection of the oil, of the yoke of Torah. In any event, so those are the two that he says expressly. Somebody who accepts the yoke of Torah and somebody who rejects the yoke of Torah. Now, if you really analyze this, clearly you're going to see something fascinating over here. Mekabel olav ol Torah, a person accepting on themselves the yoke of Torah, is not a one-hit wonder. It's not something you do once in your life. Stand at the foot of Mount Sinai, say Na'aseh v'nishma, guys, we're in, we're 100%, we're doing this, we're all aboard, gesundheit. No. Mekabel, it's interesting because if you're familiar with grammar, Hebrew grammar, and particularly the way it's used in Torah, certain words, their particular present tense form implies that they're ongoing. Mekabel is one of those words. It's ongoing. Ongoing acceptance of the Torah. That means to say that maybe yesterday I committed myself to a particular degree of Torah dedication. It's not enough for today. To be Jewish, in fact, to be human, is to grow. There's an expression that's used in Tanakh where it says, Hashem shows a vision, and he says in the vision, he says, if you follow the Torah, you will become mehalchim, those who progress, bein ha'oindim ha'eleh, compared to all these, referring to the angels, who stand still. So to be human is to progress, to be Jewish is to progress. So the goal is mekabel. Did you mekabel all Torah today? Did you accept the yoke of Torah today? That's really the question. Did a person accept the yoke of Torah today? If yes, then ma'avirin mimenu ol malchus v'ol derech eretz. Then Hashem says, whatever particular stresses you might have had today from either the bigger issues or the personal issues, I'll remove them from you because today you have done this. In other words, there are two choices at any given time. You could live according to the rules of nature, and the rules of nature is that life has stress. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but that's how it is. In nature, life has stress. If you accept the Torah every single day, that's not a natural thing to do. It's natural to say, I'm committed, I belong to this club, I buy into this religion, I've signed up once, and that's it. Debit me every month. It's not natural for a person to say, today I'm going to commit myself afresh. That's not natural. That takes a tremendous amount of work. In fact, it's almost, if you want to say, supernatural for a person. So comes along Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana and he says, if you can do that, if you can push yourself to a reality that is beyond the natural, then Hashem says, I will push your reality to beyond the natural. So whatever stress should have been on your head today, I'm going to remove it. Then there's a second possibility which is unstated. He doesn't spell it out for us in the Mishnah. And that is a person who doesn't today rededicate themselves to their Torah, but they don't reject it. In other words, this is the person who kind of plods along on an even keel. I'm pretty much dedicated. You know me. You know how frum I am. You know, like the classic argument of the husband to his wife. You know, why do I have to say I love you? The fact that I'm here should be evidence enough. You know, God, why do I have to tell you that I'm dedicated? The fact that I'm still keeping these things, surely that's, it's evidence enough. So that's the second possibility. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana doesn't discuss that because the reality is, if today you're as you were yesterday, then today you may have a slightly different experience to what you had yesterday. You haven't done anything to make today unique. So there might be some natural tsuras that come into your life, and the Torah is not going to protect you from them because you needed to, so to speak, rededicate yourself to Torah today. And the third category is the person who's already behaving in a negative way. The person who behaves in a negative way essentially means that this is somebody who says, not only am I not refreshing my commitment to the Torah today, but I'm actually downgrading my commitment. I'm actually going to be a little bit less committed than I was yesterday. Pirkei Avos old Torah. Person who says, I'm just, I don't need the Torah to be so heavy on my head. So there, what does the Mishnah say? There the Mishnah says, Noisnin alav ol malchus. Then Hashem says, okay, if you want to reject the Torah, that's fine. But then the Torah's protection, similar to what we learned in the previous Mishnah about being on the street or up alone late at night and not having the Torah's protection, it's the same kind of principle. So the Torah's, okay, you don't want to recommit yourself to Torah, that's fine. You want to reject the Torah, if that's the case, Noisnin alav. Then I'm going to give you other stress in your life. That's how it's going to be. I'll give you the stress of the government and I'll give you the stress of your personal needs, because that's what happens when a person rejects the Torah. One of the ways that a person could reject the Torah is really simply where a person turns around and says, I don't know if, I think the Torah expects things of me that are beyond what I can handle. That's a rejection of the Torah. In other words, if you believe that the Torah is impractical in your reality, that is a rejection of the Torah. Obviously, Hashem only gives us what we are capable of handling, as the expression goes, l'fum gam lo shichna, that you load the camel relative to what the camel can carry. So that's it. If Hashem gave us these expectations, we obviously can live up to them. The minute a person turns around and says, it's too stressful for me, Hashem says, okay, fine, that's fine. You don't want the stress of Torah, it's okay, I'll find you another stress. That's the way the world's going to be. As the expression, the pasuk goes, Adam le'amol yivoled. Man was created in order to work. That's why we're here. In order to work. There is no plain sailing. This notion of one day you sit and sip strawberry daiquiris on a tropical beach and that's the ultimate goal of life is not a Jewish thing. In Judaism, we believe absolutely there will always be something that makes us work. So now we get to choose. Either we work and stress over our Torah, or God forbid, Hashem says, Noisen alav, I'll give you some other work or stress. There's a story about Reb Zusha of Anipoli, the great Hasidic master, that every single day he had a system where there was a shamash, there was an attendant who used to bring him breakfast every single day. And before the guy would walk into the room, every single day, Reb Zusha used to say, please Hashem, provide me with my meal this morning. And eventually at one point the shamash got a little bit annoyed. You know, what is this? Well, why don't you recognize me? Here I am, I make you breakfast every morning. And every morning you make the same declaration. Please Hashem, provide my meal. Why don't you say, thank you Shamash for providing my meal? So he was really annoyed about it. So one morning he decided, that's it, he's gonna stand there at the door, like just out of sight, and he's not gonna bring him the breakfast. And then he'll see, Reb Zusha will see that he owes him a thank you for his breakfast. So he stands there behind the door, and Reb Zusha says, with the absolute focused intention that he always would, he says, please Hashem, provide my meal for me. And the shamash stands there. Okay, no, now you're going to see. And not a minute later, a guy walks through the door with a whole big elaborate tray of food, and he places it down in front of Reb Zusha. And he says to Reb Zusha, he says, I have to apologize to you. Yesterday you were walking somewhere. It was a very narrow bridge over the river. And you were walking in the one direction, you were walking very slowly, and I needed to get to where I was going. I didn't realize it was you, and I shoved past you. And I feel bad. I feel that I was disrespectful to such a great rabbi. So just to compensate, I brought you breakfast this morning. So then the shamash realized, okay, you know what? No messing around over here. And Hashem is, at the end of the day, the one who provides. And that's what Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana wants us to know. The derech eretz, the responsibilities that we believe, that we carry, that are so heavy, that are so stressful, that we believe that we have to be in control of, if we accept oil Torah, if we accept Hashem's Torah, if we're dedicated to Hashem, He will look after the things that we need to look after. And that's actually a taste of the time of Mashiach, because it says in the time of Mashiach, V'omdu zorim v'ra'u tzeinchem, that because the time of the Mashiach is a time where Umola ha'aretz de'as Hashem, or as the Rambam says, that lo ye'esa koloinum koloi ela ladasas Hashem belvad, that the absolute occupation of the entire world will only be to know Hashem. Therefore, because we'll be so dedicated just to Hashem's Torah and to learning, Hashem will send other people and they'll take over the running of our day-to-day lives, so we won't have to worry about any of these things. That's Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana's message. We always are going to have to work on something in life. We always will have to feel that there's something in life which we are stressed about getting right, so to speak. We get to choose. Do we want it to be the normal run-of-the-mill natural stress that everybody else has? Or will we be smart enough to choose to make Hashem's Torah our stress, and Hashem will take care of the rest for us? Kain tiyeh lanu. That should be our reality, Mitzvah Hashem. We should be able to have in our lives that Hashem takes care of all of our needs in a revealed way and give us the brachas that we all wish for ourselves and for our families, openly and without any stress, always.